Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Tiffin Talks. I have with me Gautam Bhatia. Wearing his hat is science fiction writer, although you probably know him very well as a lawyer and a deeply engaged member of society, constantly commenting on what's happening. And I, for one, follow his Twitter handle very closely to know exactly what's going on in constitutional law and matters of in legal matters as well. But here we're discussing his debut novel, The Wall, which is one of the most disturbing works I've read recently, and disturbing in one of those in deeply invigorating ways, because it allows you to think about where you are and allows you to think about the society you're living in. And I think it's quite a remarkable work for one so young. So I really want to ask him how the idea for the wall began, and really how is it so compellingly true about where we are at as a society today.
Thanks for having me on, first of all. It's a great pleasure to be here. Um, to answer the question, a lot of it came out of this thought that there are many constraints upon us in this world, um, and many of them are ideological or metaphorical. Um, just to take a very basic example from economics, this whole idea that you must balance the budgets. Every country must balance its budgets, and therefore public spending has to be reined in, and that in turn impacts the extent to which the state can intervene to rebalance inequalities in society. So just something that basic. It's an ideological argument that nonetheless has very real constraints in the actual world. And so what got me thinking was that what if you had a situation where these constraints became actually literal. In my novel, there is a wall that surrounds the
Yes.
city, and so it's what in science fiction we call a semi-closed system. Of course, the air comes in and out, and in this world, the water is abundant, source is unknown, but everything else is physically constrained because you're in a constrained space. And so I thought that when these metaphors of scarcity and of constraint that kind of bind us in our world actually become literal chains, then what would that world look like, and how would people respond to that? So that was the originating idea behind the novel. To think about what would happen when there were genuine and actual physical limitations on what people could do, imagine, see, and speak about.
Right. And to a great extent, it comes from within the people as well, and that's what worries me, because that's what worries me about the India I see today, that they in a sense have accepted these limitations about on their freedoms, on what they can say, what they can how much they can eat, how much water they can consume, even how much they can aspire for. And in a way we are headed down that road as well. And I wonder, since this is a novel that you began, I believe, 12 years ago, you were saying, uh, and yet it's so true of where we are at currently. Talk a little about that, Gautam.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there is human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, and they can adapt to a whole variety of situations without feeling the need to radically alter things.
Right.
And that adaptability is even stronger when you can create a society that is reasonably stable. So it may be somewhat unequal. It may not be ideal, but as long as it exists a baseline level of stability, and there's no great suffering or massive deprivation. And in my novel, there is no great suffering, there is no hunger. It's not that there is the kind of oppression that drives revolutions or triggers revolutions. That kind of oppression doesn't exist. And in that sense, it becomes very easy for people to adapt, and to prefer that stability continue, rather than challenge it for a future that is unknown. And so I thought that conflict is something that is worth exploring, and that's what the novel explores.
Right. And of course, there's that unstated. I thought the ode to Ramayan with Mithila being, I thought the modern day Sita, and Rama, I thought it could be the Ram of Ramayan, but it's of course, she's a woman as well. And the whole idea of this, of these two women in a way being the ideal couple in a new world where all diversity is accepted. That's quite interesting that this world, which doesn't accept so many different things, accepts this diversity at least.
Yeah, so I think that there are two things there. So one is, of course, well, the name Mithila obviously has very obvious connotations.
Yeah.
I hadn't actually
There's
myself.
a Garuda as well.
Of course, yeah. And then there's a story there that's directly borrowed from how Garuda, his elder brother lost his wings, and
Yes.
so there is that story that's there as a central motif in the novel, that if you're trying to fly out beyond the wall, then the only result is that you're going to lose your wings and fall back down. Um, so of course the name Mithila has obvious connotations. It's also a name I like a lot, so that was actually my primary motivation for having that name. I hadn't thought about the Ramayan inversion that you mentioned, but you're the
It's
second
quite
person to have mentioned it.
fascinating, it could be one that you could think of.
Well, exactly, and honestly, you're the second person who's seen that in the
Mhm.
last 3 or 4 days. Somebody else actually, told me that they saw that in the novel, and I had never thought of it. So I told them the author is dead. So I mean, honestly, it's if that's the reading, then I'm the last person to say that you can't read it that way. That is definitely a very interesting way of looking at it, and the fact that the individual is named Rama is, of course, like, it wasn't in my mind at all, but now that you mention it, it's obviously, the associations are there. Um, on
Also,
the
because
Yeah,
remember, Gautam, women will eventually save whatever world we're in.
yeah, no, for sure, for sure. And as it brings me to the second question, the acceptance of this kind of diversity in
Yeah,
this world, and that again was motivated by my thought that many of our prejudices um, are rooted in very specific, historical and material circumstances. They have no essential logic, and they're not everlasting. And so when you have a world like the world in the wall, where there's a physical constraint upon how big the world is, and therefore the fear of overpopulation
yeah,
that
that's
could
what.
constrain your resources
Hmm.
is actually a genuine and serious fear. And so therefore, rather than procreation being valorized, it actually in all likelihood could be the other way,
Yeah,
right? Where relationships that have no possibility of, in that sense, in that very physical sense,
thanks.
right? Those are relationships are the ones that are actually not only are not subjected to prejudice, but are actually considered to be at a higher plane. And so I was exploring how, when you change a couple of circumstances, you could actually have a society that exists without the kinds of prejudices,
Hmm.
both in terms of homophobia as well as misogyny, that shape our world. They need not exist in worlds that have followed a different historical material path. And I think and there I'm inspired by Ursula Le Guin, who said very famously that the task of the science fiction writer, is to imagine alternatives to the way that we live. And I think that if you're a science fiction writer and you're creating a society, to me it's natural to imagine one that is non-misogynistic and non-homophobic,
Yeah.
and then explore how that plays out.
Even though it may have all our other faults of deep
Well,
inequality and
yeah, so it may have hierarchies, it may have other forms of hierarchy, inequality, and so on. But you can definitely, in certain ways, explore what it means when some hierarchies and some inequalities are absent. um, and of course, that helps you to kind of write in a world in which the other hierarchies as well are not immutable and are not permanent,
right.
but are always subject to challenge, and that's also a central theme of the novel.
Talk a little about about language and the power of language, because for instance, when Mithila is talking about the horizon and explaining the horizon, I mean, these are words that have obviously been lost. And we also are in danger of losing certain words, or actually accepting certain words which then become part of our vocabulary. And not to stretch to find a point, but things like tukre tukre gang, or urban naxals, or the Khan market gang, how, or the pseudo secularism, the whole idea of pseudo secularism, when LK Advani first espoused it, how these words become so entrenched in our minds. So we can gain words and lose them, and how important it is to know what words we're using. I think that's uh, quite a remarkable thing that comes out in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and the connection between language, imagination, and the world is something that has always interested me,
Right.
and you see it in some of the really good science fiction, works around China Mieville's Embassy Town, and going way back, Samuel Delany's, work actually centrally explored this relationship between the language we have and the world that we inhabit. We have this really famous, almost an old chestnut by now, that in Homer's Iliad,
Hmm.
there is a phrase, the wine dark sea, and whatever else the color of the sea is, it's not the color of wine that we know. And so there was a famous book called, it was called Through the Language Glass,
Yeah.
which explored why Homer used the word wine dark sea, the phrase
Why did
wine dark
he?
sea.
Why
Uh,
did he?
it's because the Greek color spectrum was different. And so
Okay.
on the Greek color spectrum, the colors that were available to them,
Right.
and the colors that they basically classified as colors, on that spectrum, the color blue, green, and the color of wine was on the
No.
same. It fell within the same definition of
Right.
one color. Because how you arrange the spectrum is subjective. It's that's the function of language. So what we say is blue, green, yellow, red. That isn't the only way. That's a very contingent way of describing the naturally occurring color spectrum. And if you have a different way of arranging that spectrum through language, then you will, perceive things differently. And so again, keeping with the theme of the fact that in our world many of these things are subjective and
Yeah.
metaphorical. In this world they are physical. So in this world, because there is a wall that blocks off,
Yeah.
everything beyond that, there does not exist a word for the horizon.
Hmm.
And if you don't have a word for the horizon, you can't imagine what a horizon
Exactly.
might look like.
Exactly.
If you can't imagine what a horizon might look like, there is no powerful reason for you to want it.
Right.
And so a part of the book actually deals with, what I think John Berger called ways of seeing,
Yes.
learning to see. That for the first time, you are trying to see in your mind what the horizon might look like, and to have a word for it is the first step towards being able to see it, and then that's the first step towards doing something about it. So that was, and I think you'll see a lot more of that in book two. But that was kind of really, a motivating idea underlying the novel.
The other thing I found quite interesting, Gautam, is the whole idea of freedom of expression. So you have freedom of expression ostensibly, but with these restrictions, which is almost like our Article 19, with reasonable restrictions, with whoever deciding what these reasonable restrictions will be. And
Yeah.
that again is fascinating, that, so you can say, but you can only say so much.
Yeah.
Talk about that as well. It's so interesting.
Yeah, so I think again that it's so we what we are used to is censorship, right? Very
Yeah,
direct,
exactly.
and like direct gagging, or censoring, or banning, and so on. And of course, there is a part of that in the novel, where they try to ban this group of people who want to go beyond the wall, and there's a fight over that, and all that's there. But again, what interests me more is not so much as physical censorship, because that's something you can see, and the moral spectrum there, the moral calculus is very clear. You are against censorship, so that's very, very obvious. I think what's more interesting is not so much censoring or banning, but how some ideas or some again, some words or some ways of imagining the world, effectively are treated as illegitimate or in a certain sense beyond the pale.
Hmm.
So there may not be any action against you for saying those words, but nobody will listen to you when you say them, because they don't resonate within
Right.
the broader vocabulary that has come to shape people's experiences. And so again, you have this famous line that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So
Yeah.
that kind of speaks to that. So um, if you construct an alternative to what a capitalistic world might look like, uh, just that it may exist, but it's just impossible for many people to be able to receive that as they do any other kind of speech. And so in this case, in this novel, a large part of it is the attempt that Mithila and her companions make to find words and to find a language that will convey or communicate to the rest of the people that going beyond the wall is something that needs to be done. And they try metaphor, they try myths. There's an analogy with Plato's cave at one point.
Hmm.
So they try poetry. So they try different ways of finding that language that will communicate those ideas in a city where those ideas have just lost any kind of balance. And for me, when you speak of freedom of speech, that's a much more interesting thing to explore than censorship and banning. And like you said, how certain words change meaning, go out of fashion, are tagged with baggage that then they can't shed. So these are all things I think that really go to the heart of free speech in a more complex way than censorship and banning.
For instance, just the politics of love in India, if you talk about that, you're laughed out of the room, at a
Yeah,
time of so much toxicity and hatred. If you talk about love and healing and
yeah,
kindness, you're considered a joke. This is what we have come to.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah, that's exactly right. And the way that it's not just law or like the state, but social norms that place
Society is,
limits on,
yeah,
yeah, on what can,
society itself sort of
yeah,
starts accepting it.
yeah.
Talk about the hedonists as well. I found them again quite fascinating. They, for me, mirror the middle class of today. Quite happy with.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to caricature anyone, and I think again, just in book two, you'll see
It's not
the
caricature; it's description.
they have their own complexities. But no, so again, I thought that a natural there are two or three responses that people can have to being shut in, whether metaphorically or
Yeah.
literally. One, of course, is to try and get out and to try and go out, and that's what motivates the protagonists of the story, Mithila and her companions. The other is to adapt. Like I said, we are really adaptable creatures, for better or for worse. Um, and the third is a certain kind of nihilistic reaction. I think you always find, specifically in societies in decline. There's a famous Auden poem about nihilism in the late Roman Empire and so on. So nihilism is always one reaction that you have to a decaying society and to the feeling of confinement and suffocation. And I felt that it would be incomplete without exploring how at least some people would react nihilistically to this, to being shut in and being confined.
Hmm.
And that would take this form of saying, okay, there's nothing to be had here, so let's, while we can disrupt as much and derive whatever pleasure we can from disrupting
Hmm.
and engaging in effectively meaningless activities, because you don't really have anything meaningful in this kind of world within a wall. So if nothing is meaningful, then why search for that meaning? So I thought that would be something fun to just like play with and explore as one reaction to what was happening.
Talk a little more about Mithila because she's quite a fascinating character. And, for people who may not have read the book as yet, I hope they will. Talk a bit about her and her impulses and um, her love for her brother, which really drives her to this, and drives her to be this constant insurrectionist. So
Yeah, I think
explain her.
it is interesting because people have responded to the novel and said that they find her an annoying character,
Why?
and I think it's actually, yes, she's not meant to. So she's not an easy protagonist. She's not
Ah,
an. So one thing I wanted to avoid was a book with easy heroes and easy villains, and I
yes,
know that real life doesn't have easy heroes and villains. Real life has complex people, and people ultimately who you find are doing the right things are often doing them for reasons that are, they could be obsessive, which Mithila is. They could be hostile to making long-lasting social connections because they're so fixated upon what they want to do, and many things like that. So in that sense, I wanted to make her a character whom you can't very smoothly or easily sympathize with at all times. And at various times, actually find her acting in ways that people don't like because they're not actually good things that she's doing. So in that sense, I wanted like the protagonist to be not the not a classic hero, but someone who and I won't even go down the whole route of being a flawed person, because everyone's flawed. There's no big deal in making somebody flawed. We're all flawed, but just somebody that readers would not always easily identify with, and would in fact at times struggle to do that. So that was one thing, and but at the same time, um, what I wanted to write was a character who was absolutely honest about what she was doing and why she was doing it, for better or for worse. And so for her, uh, the uh, the motivation to find the way beyond the wall is something that is part of her and it exists. And while she is not always able to communicate why she feels that way, and why it exists to others, uh, it doesn't her failure to communicate that doesn't affect the way that she continues to believe in it. So I think there's that sense of internal honesty that I wanted to write. And of course, the novel begins with her brother also in the scene,
yeah,
and he's kind of a figure who's charismatic, a leader, and kind of guides the whole group, and she's always trying to then later fill that space.
right.
I think that one interesting thing about human beings that I found, is that sometimes you want to fill a role that your personality or your worldview is not really suited for,
Right.
but you feel that it's an obligation on you to have to fill that role. I think we've all felt that at various times, and to and when you're trying to fill that role that you're not really, you know,
Inter-
that you don't actually want to, there ends up a lot of internal conflict, where you keep thinking you're not doing enough. You're not. What would he have done, or what would she have done? Were they in my place? They're not anymore. And so that always leaves you with this constant sense of self doubt, and inadequacy in a certain way. So I thought that was again, as if a sense that's so universal, and so common that we all have, that that would be an important part of who she is and what her character is like.
Makes me think of a couple of political leaders, at least one political leader I know, who would, you just have to change the gender and it would be quite perfect. That's the marvelous thing about the book, Gautam. It allows you to dream, and it allows you to fit in so much of what's happening. And, and of course, it takes, I think it will require one more reading to truly sort of, immerse yourself into that world. And I don't think it'll be heavy reading. It's quite fascinating. But this is the kind of book that really demands your attention as a reader, and I think that is so good, because even with reading now, we become so used to breezy, easy reading. It's almost like watching another Netflix movie or whatever. Sometimes reading should demand this attention from you, and that's what I like about this book. It holds you and it draws you in, and you have to actually read it to understand some of its dimensions again.
No, thank you. I mean, that it was meant to be like a slow book, not slow in the slow paced, but in the
Yeah,
sense
but
that
yeah,
to
to
be
draw
read.
you
So,
in,
yeah, yeah, and I think, and actually there are many little references here and there that I wouldn't reveal, but I think might become more evident on a second reading. Little like, um,
Talk a
somewhat
bit about
higher pointed.
Sumer. Talk a bit about Sumer, and that you obviously have a fascination for that civilization. Talk a bit about that.
Well, I mean, so no, so it's not really based on the Sumerian civilization.
Right,
The inspiration for the name was actually Meru, the mountain, and kind of the circular seas that surround that. Then, of course, Sumer also refers to the Sumerians. So I mean, there is that reference, but it wasn't the primary reference. The primary reference was this kind of the circular seas surrounding the Meru mountain, and in this novel, there is kind of like this mysterious forum in the middle of the city, the exact center, where you have these four great towers that the
right,
builders who built the wall left behind, and nobody knows, you know, what they're doing there, what their purpose is,
right,
except that they're just these massive towers of a material that people don't know, have been left behind by whatever civilization it was that built the city. Um, with respect to Sumer, I think what the things that interested me were again this distinction between imagining time and imagining space as circular or linear, and you find this repeated across times and civilizations and across the world, that for many societies and cultures, uh, time was not something that was linear, and the way we measure time or understand time. In fact, thinking about time as strictly linear is something that evolved with the evolution of contemporary capitalism, in its proto form in the late medieval
yeah,
period. Treating time as linear, as time to time, and kind of synchronizing your body clock, with the working day,
right,
and marking time in this kind
yeah,
of fashion of time, heading forward. That's actually not, again, it's not an essential part of who we are. It's something
yeah,
that evolved.
absolutely. Because in
Yeah.
agrarian societies, your body clock automatically
Well,
adapts
that,
to.
well, that yes, until the medieval periods, people would sleep twice a day,
Yeah,
uh, in short shifts, and you
that's
measure
something
time.
I could get used to.
Exactly. And you measure time in through events, right? Through events, and so in the year that X happened, in the year that
Right,
so and so came, right? So it's not, again, so it's not. And I've read a fair bit of science fiction in the last few years, written by people from various countries in Africa, and they really draw upon this idea in a much more evolved fashion. And so I think that so looking at the city where the idea of a circle, things
right.
coming back to where they were, plays a crucial role, was important. And of course, that serves as again, like any idea or concept, can become both a prison and something that liberates you. So
Hmm.
it liberates you in the sense that you're not bound to linear time, counting down the hours and so on. At the same time, it imprisons you in the sense that if everything comes back to where it began, there is no possibility of again changing things, or moving forward. And so one central kind of conflict in the novel is between those who want to maintain
Yeah,
the circle and circular time as fundamental to human existence, and those who believe that the wall and this idea of circular time that the wall kind of forces you to be in is preventing them, from really being able to be whatever human beings can be.
hmm. So, how did you write this, Gautam? I mean, did you write this in fits and starts, or did you write this seamlessly over time? Did you write this over many drafts? Because it is so layered. So I wonder how
Yeah, no, I mean,
you
there
did
were
it.
many drafts. There were very many drafts. The first draft was 12 years ago. In second draft, then there was the second and third draft around that time, during
But
that
your
time.
characters remain the same.
No, characters changed, characters evolved, genders changed, genders evolved. Like, I mean, all of that over time changed. The first draft was much more, was much more male centric. I was much younger. I, was much less exposed to kind of the real diversity of writing, and even the diversity of the world. I was still modeling myself on the classic dead white male science fiction writers, the Asimovs and the Clarks. And now I hope I know better. So the original draft was much more sparse, was much more male. Like, read, and the names were all white. Like, the names were all like white names. So
Okay.
so yeah. So I was very much in that vision of being inspired by, I mean, the books I had access to as a kid, in
Right.
Delhi bookshops. also all of that really evolved, and then there were 3 or 4 drafts at that time. And then when I began to practice law, it became suspended for a few years. I didn't do any work on it. It was the back of my mind. It was there, but there was no work being done on it. And I came back to it in 2018, and then over a year and a half, rewrote
Hmm.
it, and that went through 3 or 4 drafts, and then finally that was what you see before you today.
It's really been a long, long haul.
Yeah. It's
Just
been
with this book for many years, but
yeah, since
the
2008.
sequel will
Yeah.
be quicker, I think.
See, a sequel's almost done. I'm in the draft finished. I'm in the edits right now. I'm in fact halfway through my edits,
Wow.
and the deadline for that is the end of the year.
Hmm.
And so at the end of the year, the book will go to the publisher, and it's due out middle of next year.
So
So the normal,
you're really
sorry,
now deeply involved in these
yeah,
characters and in this
yeah.
world.
Yeah. I mean, now it's hard to stop. So uh, as one character says in book one, you can't stop yourself. So
Yeah.
it's hard to stop now, but I see it finishing by December end, and then it's over to the publisher, their schedule, and I've been told that middle of the year. So normal 1 year gap between book one and a sequel. It'll be that.
I wonder how much of Mithila there is in you and how much of you there is in Mithila.
Not at all. I mean, I think it's very dangerous for writers to write themselves into the characters, especially protagonists. You end up doing all kinds of indulgences. So no, I've been very conscious
Right.
to write a character that is not it is drawn from people I do know, but not from myself. I think that's a trap for a writer.
Right. Gautam, how does your day job as a lawyer and as a quite prolific writer on law as well, how does that fit in with this life? Because you have a very rich writer's life as well, a science fiction writer's life as well. You're associated with Strange
Yeah.
Horizons, and you've obviously, you're deeply immersed in that world itself. How do these two worlds meet? Do they collide occasionally, or do they exist quite happily in harmony?
So they collide in some ways and complement each other in some ways. They collide in the sense that legal writing is a polar opposite um, to fiction, and specifically science fiction.
Right.
When you're writing law, at least for me, the whole point is to be as direct, as spare with your words, and as austere in your style as you can be, because the whole point is to communicate meaning in the clearest and most direct way to whoever is reading you, judges, other lawyers, the public, and so on. Uh, in fiction and science fiction, the whole point is to communicate meaning indirectly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anything is indirect, elliptically.
exactly right. So you're engaging in the exact other, the enterprise is directly opposed to it. You're using metaphors and analogies and
I wonder
imagery.
if they seep into each other. It'll be disastrous.
Exactly. In fact, the first draft. I mean, so one of the major challenges that I had in writing, and my editors pointed out to me, was that it was sounding too much like written voice,
Ah,
the novel, and so like the dialogues were sounding like they were written, like what people would say if they were writing their dialogues, and not as if they were speaking. And so a lot of work had to be done on making it better. And I'm sure the remnants is still very much there, because you can't eliminate that from your system. So in that sense, as I said to you earlier, there was a lot of unlearning to be done for writing this novel. It was first unlearn and then like relearn, how to write fiction. So in that sense, these worlds collide, and I think I've been able to find a balance now. But in the beginning, I mean, the my legal writing style, which I'd done every day for 6 years, was as you said, seeping into to fiction. I think it's now but in many important ways they complement. So I think what my career as a lawyer has really taught me is the ways in which law is, as I've said before, plumbing of the world. So you don't see it, but every day
there.
the law decides what you can do and what you can't. Of course, you see it in the big dramatic cases, 377 and Aadhaar and all of that. So then yes, you see the law over there. But just on a daily basis, the way the law affects everything you can do or not do, and the way it structures the political economy of a society, you know everything from drug prices to textbook prices, it's all the function of the intellectual property regime, and so on. So that understanding was really important, because then I'm aware when I'm writing that I have to pay attention to the legal structures of the world I'm creating
mm,
uh, to make it a genuine and true world. Again, those legal things will be backstage. So sometimes they can appear. So in this novel, you have these marriage license laws that
yeah,
try to prevent population explosion while also maintaining class hierarchies by imposing a license upon marriages,
right.
that
Right.
go across the circles. And of course, you
Yeah,
have
that's very interesting. Not allowing the classes to marry each other.
yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
not really not lying, but just disincentivizing them, and the
Yeah,
idea being that
listen,
you kind
yeah,
of kill two birds with one stone.
yeah,
You maintain the class structure, and also you also prevent population explosion. So so in that sense, it's at some point the laws will come front stage. At the same time, you have to also think, okay, this is a society with scarce resources. So who controls those resources? You have farms that have to be renewed, every season, because otherwise they'll exhaust themselves. Who decides, and how do they decide what the quota will be, and how the food will be produced and sold? So all of those become legal issues. And so although those things don't appear in the novel, but you have to know as the writer what they
right,
are, to
right,
make sure that your world is internally consistent.
right.
So I think in that sense, doing the law and engaging with the law really teaches you the importance of the law as a backdrop to world building and science fiction.
And even when change is suggested, it's change in, say, how the stone mansions will be occupied
Yeah,
by rotation, or
yeah,
I mean, it's quite fascinating. All that, to keep that in the back of your mind and to create such a complex society with such complex rules and laws, but yet, as you said, which may not be evident to the naked
yeah,
eye, right? So it's
yeah,
pretty much like our world now.
yeah. So again, I mean, if you look at any kind of egalitarian,
Yeah,
equality-based movements, they always begin with land,
yeah,
because that is the heart of everything.
right.
And so again, I mean, here in the novel as
Uh,
well, the reform kind of the idea of equality begins with okay, let's redistribute how land is occupied.
right,
Whether it's the farmers who want like a greater share in the farmland produce, or social reformers who want to circulate housing in a way that everyone lives in big houses and everyone kind of periodically lives in like worse circumstances. It always starts with just the very basic physical fact of the land you're on.
hmm,
um, and of course in our world that is codified in increasingly complex laws. So again, law comes into the picture. So without changing the legal structure, you can't change the question of how land is reorganized. In our history, Zamindari Acts and land sealing laws, all of that were attempts to bring about a more equal society through the vehicle of land.
and the builders being the people who control everything.
Well, in this case, now it's the elders who are right now. They're the council. The builders, nobody knows who they really are, and
Yeah,
they have left ages ago. So yeah,
pretty much like Delhi.
yeah.
So, talk a bit about your influences, Gautam, your literary influences.
In science fiction, a massive influence is Ursula Le Guin. She's, I think, a canonical, really a canonical figure, legendary figure. Um,
Did
her
you come
novels,
to
like
her in your childhood or later?
in my childhood. So when I was I think 7 or 8 years old, my mom and dad brought me a copy of The Wizard of Earthsea, which of course is a fantasy. It's
Yeah,
not science fiction. And later on, I read The Dispossessed, Left Hand of Darkness,
right,
The Ones Who Walk Away from Omphala's short story. And much more recently, I read The Word for World is Forest.
right.
Um, I think with Ursula Le Guin, what you get is, well, a brilliant storytelling, powerful imagination, but also, and this is something I try to emulate, is this whole idea that these structures that constrain and govern our lives are all contingent and are all human creations, and therefore can be undone by human beings. And so we're not perpetually stuck
Hmm.
with the structures that imprison us or constrain us. I think that comes across very powerfully, whether she's dealing with economics, as in The Dispossessed, with sexuality, as in The Left Hand of Darkness, although that's a controversial novel now because of its treatment of
Yeah,
sexuality, um, or nature and the environment, as in The Word for World is Forest. So you always have in her novels, they're never dystopic. There's always the idea that what has been built by human beings can be undone by human beings in a better direction. and nothing is permanent or unchanging. So she's a huge influence. Um, Growing up, I read a lot of Isaac Asimov because he was available.
Yeah.
That was the book that was there, and now I don't. Now he's not that big an influence, and I think the genre also has moved on quite a bit. And of course, he had a very bad history of sexual harassment, which I only
Yeah.
recently found out
Yeah.
about. So I mean, I feel much more uncomfortable with Asimov than I used to. But growing up, he was an inevitable shaping influence, and there's no denying that.
Right.
So Asimov was a big influence, and more recently there has been a real explosion of outstandingly good science fiction written by a diverse plurality of writers across the world, and so I recently being a couple of years ago, when I was reviewing for the Clark Award for Strange Horizons, I read Yoon Ha Lee's Hexarchate series, Machineries of Empire,
Hmm.
um, and the again the sheer breadth of imagination that he brings to his science fiction. I think it's they bring to their science fiction, is stunning. So that is one huge influence among contemporary science fiction writers. There's a fantastic Cuban biochemist, punk rock, a science fiction writer called Yoss,
Yes.
who recently has been Yoss, Yoss, and he's recently been translated into English.
Uh-huh.
He writes in Spanish, and
Right.
again, there's a certain exuberance to
Hmm.
his writing mixed with the sadness that's really powerful. So I read him. I really enjoy him a lot as well. Yeah.
What about Indian science fiction? We don't have such a big tradition, do we? Why is that?
So, so I mean, I think you have a fantastic tradition in non-English languages. So
Okay.
in
There is?
Bengali there was Kalpvigyan. I've got I'm
Yes.
sure I've mangled the pronunciation.
Yeah.
In Marathi there was and is a science fiction tradition.
Okay.
So in non-English languages you have, and there's a scholar called Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay who works in Oslo. He
Uh-huh.
has he researches on non-English language science fiction and has
Okay.
written stuff on it. Mimi Mondal wrote a piece for Tor a couple of years
That's
ago
right. Yeah,
on the
yeah.
history of Indian science fiction. So I think that's as far as non-English goes.
Right.
As far as English language goes, I think you're right. There's not too much yet.
There's
Uh,
Samit Basu, of course.
yeah. So it begins. So I think it begins with, and so again, we're talking here about not myth, like not
Yeah.
mythic fantasy. So mythic
Yeah.
fantasy sells brilliantly in India.
I'm
Amish
with
and
you.
Banker and all that. So that there's a huge market, and that's one kind of writing, and not judging it, but that is like it's one kind of writing, right? This is a different kind of writing, and so it begins with Samit Basu, and that's more in the fantasy genre back in 2002 with the Simoquin prophecies. And Samit, of course, is kind of pioneer and trailblazer in that sense. And then you more recently you have both. So you have people like Vandana Singh and SB Divya. I'm talking about novelists right now. Vandana Singh, of course, short stories, but been around for a long time, who are Indian but who live abroad. So there is that. And there's a younger generation, Mimi Mondal, Shiv Ramdas. They're all living in the US, working in the US, and writing some great stuff.
Hmm.
Um, Among people who continue to live in India long term. So after Summit, you had Indra Das, who wrote The Devourers back in 2015.
Yeah.
A very very nice story. You have Anil Menon, who wrote a book called Half of What I Say, 2016, kind of near future dystopic India. And even more recently, you have Tashan Mehta's The Liar's Weave, which was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And
And
this
I
year,
suppose you could say Prayag's
of course,
as
Leila, of course, yeah. Leila is science fiction. Leila is a fantastic novel. Leila is like brilliant.
well.
So there's Leila, now a TV series as well.
Yeah.
And this year, Samit published a new novel, Chosen Spirits.
Yeah.
And you had Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan's Analog Virtual, which was set in a near future Bangalore. So it's still, I mean, it's still not too much of it. Although now you have like maybe 3 or 4 books a year, novels a year. I think that the reasons for it are there are 2 or 3 reasons for it. One is that a writer can survive only if there's a public,
Hmm.
and if you look at the science fiction reading public in India, it exists and it's a discerning public. It's a good public, but for whatever reason, lack of communication or whatever, a large percentage of the public still goes to the Western writers as their first port of call. So I'm in a couple of Facebook groups, and whenever science fiction is mentioned and recommendations are asked for, it's always the same names. If it's fantasy, it's J.K. Rowling, the usual, if it's George R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan, like names back when I was growing up in 2005, when Samit was the only person around, those were the names. And they're still the names even now, 15 years later. In science fiction, you're still Asimov and Clarke and then now the annual Hugo winners maybe and so on. And so I think there's still this belief that Indians can only write literary fiction, and Indians can't write genre fiction. Indians can't write science fiction. And so when we talk about science fiction, we go straight to the West. And so once I very gently said in one of these Facebook groups, after a long thread, look, this thread is only white names, and then somebody's like, oh, Samit Basu, sorry. So Samit Samit who's like as established and has been writing for years and years, and is literally kind of like the pioneer of English language Indian science fiction, is an afterthought. Right? And the rest of us are not even thoughts, right? So I think that has to change, and that can only change, I think, if you have an infrastructure that exists in the Western world. So you have like cons, conventions, science fiction conventions, magazines. You have the Mithila Review right now in India, but that's the only one. So magazines, science fiction awards like the Hugos, for India. Pakistan now has its own science fiction awards, by the way. They're called the Salam Awards.
Wow.
So science. So you need to build that community that in which readers and writers can come together, which I hope now that there is a critical mass of writers, comes into existence. And I think the third thing again is that if you're an Indian science fiction writer, and you look at and see all of this, your response then will be, okay, let me find an agent in the US or the UK.
Right.
That agent will then find me Harper Voyager or like Orbit Books or Tor. I will be published in the US or the UK as an Indian like export. And through that, I will find my way back to India, right? Because only when the West validates my work will Indians read me. And I'm not blaming anyone. I can't blame anyone for that, right? Like it's a very legitimate response to what you see happening around you. I think again that need to change. Like an Indian writer has to look and see that, okay, what happened this year? Samit publishing with Simon and Schuster, Lavanya publishing with, I think, with Juggernaut. I'll recheck, and me publishing with HarperCollins India, right, is a viable path to a writing career. So unless Indian writers see that, they're going to keep going down the American agent, American publishing house, American like route, and that will just perpetuate, the situation. And of course, like as I said, like it's a very legitimate thing for writers to do. And it's, if you want to have a writing career, and if unlike say I have a fallback, which is the law, right? But if you want to have a writing career, you should in fact go down this route, because it's a much better route to success than the Indian route. So until that changes, that will continue to happen. So I think that these are some of the kind of interconnected things that are still holding back Indian sci-fi writing in English from becoming part of the mainstream, so to say.
Also, I think what you mentioned briefly, Gautam, that our own epics actually are so rich, and they're being retold currently and reinvented and re-examined. I think that's also partly the reason why there's a lot more focus there than to building imaginary worlds, because those worlds are also still being explored.
No, I think that's completely correct. But at the same time, I don't think the two kind of are exclusive. So you have a lot of mythic retelling from both sides. You have mythic retelling that kind of entrenches those myths, and you also have mythic retelling that questions those myths. So until the lions, this is a book, I can't remember it, but there was a book by Arshia Sattar, I think, recently. So you have, and of course Mashvita Devi's stories of the Mahabharata. So I mean, you have that tradition as well. So you have both things going on. But I think that like, so again, if you look at the West, they also have that. There was a new Beowulf translation like last month, right? So they are still doing their exploration of myths. That hasn't stopped them from having like a distinctive science fiction culture. So I think that the two can really coexist and should coexist, with one drawing from the other.
I wonder if Netflix or Amazon would approach you, who would your vote be to play Mithila?
I haven't thought about that. I need to think about that.
Better start thinking, because I'm sure it's going to happen.
I will give it some thought.
It's quite a fascinating book to explore as a series. I see it.
It is very visual. Yes, well. It's quite visual. Yeah,
it's very visual.
Yeah.
And
No, I
it's
mean, I would love for it to happen, but when it happens,
let's
yeah,
start a campaign.
yeah,
So when the next interview comes up, you have to have a name ready to
name
play.
ready. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Gautam Bhatia, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And as I said, I have to go back and reread it again. And I would urge everyone who reads it to read it twice, to really explore fully and to sort of immerse fully in this wonderful world you've created, which is all too chillingly real. So,
Thanks so much for having me. The questions are wonderful, and I love this discussion.
no,
I hope the sequel will also be enjoyable for you.
of course, thank you so much. And will continue to follow all that you write in both avatars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bye.